Hi there again. My name is Dr. Ryan Galloway, and I'm going to talk to you about the AI interoperability negative, the negative side of the AI interoperability case that is in your materials. So I'm going to start by talking about disadds to the AI interoperability app. I'm going to talk about counterplans. I'm going to talk about critiques. I'm going to talk about advantage answers and the solvency attacks against this affirmative. Okay. The first disadvantage you're going to have to be ready to deal with is just the AI bad disadvantage. You might call it the rogue AI disadvantage, whatever you want to call it. The idea that artificial intelligence is bad, we ought to try and stop researching this technology because it will lead to it getting out of control. And there are a lot of prominent scholars and physicists, etc., who argue that artificial intelligence is a risk to human beings, and we ought not to research it. Now, the obvious answer that the affirmative is going to provide is that AI is inevitable, and it's just a question of whether or not China and the US or the US gets it. But I think the affirmative goes a step further and says that they will advance AI technology, and there's lots of good evidence that cooperation with Europe will advance AI technology. And there's pretty good evidence that says we ought to just stop researching AI technology and we ought to put the brakes on it as best we can, because if we put the brakes on it, we'll be better able to control it. So the AF expands artificial intelligence, and advances in artificial intelligence risk getting out of control. There are some really smart people and who take this out of the science fiction literature. Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, Bill Gates all say that there are real risks to artificial intelligence getting out of control, and that we lack the ability to control artificial intelligence, and it's an existential threat to human beings. So while it may be something you just run as turns to the affirmative, I do think you ought to be aware of the idea that there's a great deal of literature about why AI is bad. I'm also going to be talking, when I talk about the turns to the specific affirmative, about the reasons why in the military realm specifically, artificial intelligence might be problematic. Other disadds are a Russia backlash disadvantage or a NATO bad disadvantage. The plan certainly makes NATO stronger. It bolsters NATO's military, and so any disadvantage to bolstering NATO's military will be problematic. That freaks Russia out. It risks Ukraine escalation. You can argue that the war in Ukraine is going to be contained right now, but that if Russia fears NATO, that it will attack a NATO member like the Baltics, and that will only make things worse. There's an obvious China disadvantage. You can claim Chinese hegemony is good. This argument has become popular on the college level, that Chinese hegemony is superior to US hegemony, and it would be good if China won the AI race that the affirmative claims to stop China from winning. There's also a good politics disadvantage link, that there's lots of domestic resistance to cooperating with Europe on AI. We'd have to share our technology with them when we view them as a competitor. They would also require privacy standards, which domestic tech companies don't like. And the domestic tech lobby is very powerful, and you can have good links to politics from the affirmative. Counterplans. There's obviously the domestic and unilateral counterplan that can solve AI leadership. This was run a lot on last year's college antitrust topic. People would argue that if you bolstered US leadership on AI, that you could stop China from bolstering AI. The affirmative is going to claim that NATO is key to this, but I think you can win that the US on its own can ramp up its AI technology, that it can ramp up its AI innovation, and can compete successfully with China without including NATO. There's obviously the non-NATO counterplan or the EU counterplan. A lot of evidence advocates working with the EU instead of NATO, and so any NATO bad disadvantage you have is a net benefit. There are also some good critiques to this. Obviously, the plan demonizes China and Russia. So the security K will be big on this topic. I also think the security K can be a net benefit to the EU or the non-NATO counterplan, because you can argue that the plan is forced to securitize because of the security cooperation language in the topic, and the counterplan doesn't necessarily securitize. It can risk making those threats from China and Russia real when we demonize them, when we say China's out to rule the world, when we say Russia's out to rule the world. We would treat them as if they were those threats, and that risks making them real. There's also the various critiques of technology. The Heidegger critique would argue that technology separates us from nature, and that allows dominating nature to become easier, or it allows for dominating other human beings to become easier because we rely upon technology instead of becoming close to nature. Now I'm going to talk about the advantage answers for the AI leadership advantage. I think you can argue that the West is going to win this race now, that there's a culture of innovation that's created in the West, that we have more bottom-up resources, and that China is top-down, and China is not taking an ethical approach to AI to get other people on board. And so the entire thesis of the advantage is wrong if China does not win this race. And I think you can have a lot of good evidence that says the West will win this race in the status quo, and that AI will be peacefully developed now. There's also a big body of literature that comes primarily from Michael Horowitz, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and also won the national debate tournament in college in 2000, that says that AI technology isn't key to military power. So an underlying thesis of this advantage is that AI technology will lead to balance of power changes, and that AI technology is so important that it will lead to China taking over the world and having more hegemony and having more influence. But there's good evidence that just says technology historically has not done that, and that it's the way that technology is used and not the technology itself that's more important. So the development of the AI technology is not as important as how it's put to use, which the affirmative can't control. You can also argue that Chinese leadership is good. There's a plethora of literature on this that says China is more peaceful than the United States, that China engages in dialogue, that China is better able to get nations on board for things like solving climate change. And I won't get into that literature too in depth today, except to say that you can win, that China winning the AI arms race is good. Then we get into the liberal international order, and whether the liberal international order explains the peaceful relations we've had in the world in the last 70 years. So a lot of people like Steven Pinker will say the world is actually more peaceful than it has been in quite some time, and we need to sort of figure out why. And Eikenberry and others will argue that it's the liberal international order, that it's this organization of Western institutions like the UN, like the World Bank, like the IMF, that have led to peace. But there may be other factors that are key. Nuclear weapons might be a critical reason why we're more at peace than we were before, that there's more deterrence in the world than there was before. It might be because of free trade and interdependence, not having anything to do with these institutions that have been created, but the notion that free trade has expanded and advanced, and the liberal international order is not the fundamental reason for the peace we see today. Also, it may be the case that other nations just aren't going to accept China as a leader. If the idea is that China will become the world hegemon, China is nationalistic, other nations aren't going to accept China's authoritarian, top-down leadership. There was a lot of backlash to China cracking down on Hong Kong, And as a result of that, Chinese hegemony isn't a realistic possibility. And you can just argue defense against a US-China war, that nuclear weapons deter the US and China from going to war, that trade interdependence deters the US and China from going to war, that both sides know that it would be an ugly mess, and even if it wouldn't escalate to a nuclear level, neither side wants that conventional war because both sides want to develop their economies at home. So there's a lot of ways to just attack the AF on its merits and prove that the advantage of Chinese AI leadership is false. Now, for conflict resolution, there's a big debate in the literature both about the use of AI in conventional applications and the use of AI in nuclear weapons as to whether or not AI increases the risk of accidents. And history is kind of on the side of human control of these weapons and not turning it over to artificial intelligence. We've had 70 years since the Cold War of no use of nuclear weapons in a hostile situation. And as a result of that, it's because human beings were involved and said, hey, this doesn't look right. Hey, we're not going to let this get out of control. If we turn too much over this to AI, then that might increase the risk of accidents and increase the risk of instability because you don't have a human being at the wheel of control that says we cannot escalate this and let this get out of control. You instead have a machine that lacks that human empathy, that lacks that human emotion, that lacks that human judgment, making decisions about the future of the world. With regard to arms control, nations are likely not going to agree to arms control. They've built up their weapons. They have prestige involved in their weapons. They think their weapons are key to security. So even increasing verification of arms control is not going to lead to the political impulse that leads to arms control because nations don't want to get rid of their weapons. AI might also increase vulnerability to cyber attacks because it favors the offense over the defense, and that AI can better break down cybersecurity than it can building it up. And as a result of that, if we're trying to look towards AI to enhance our ability to deal with cyber conflicts, we might be looking in the wrong place. It might actually make us more vulnerable than we were before. You can also make the argument in arms control that arms control is relatively strong now. We have the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are only 9 nations with nuclear weapons. Nations are generally bringing their nuclear arsenals down, and the world is relatively at peace with nuclear arms control. So we don't need the affirmative in order to solve these problems. With regard to the solvency, NATO nations are very far apart on AI technology. Now, there's an interesting question as to what the affirmative is allowed to do on this topic, because the topic says increase security cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Does that mean that the affirmative gets to fiat working with NATO? Does that mean that the affirmative is a standing offer to NATO? Does this mean the affirmative is more like what we traditionally think of as a consult counter plan, where the offer made by the affirmative is the beginning point of consultation? But there are 30 nations in NATO. They're at very different points of development of artificial intelligence. They have different ideas as to what we should do with artificial intelligence. The notion that they're going to sit down and agree as to how to use it in future operations is fairly unrealistic, and I think is kind of a fatal problem with the affirmative. And I think it will be a problem with a lot of affirmatives on this topic, is the idea of actually getting NATO to agree to one of these affirmatives is going to be very difficult because there are 30 nations that have to operate on a consensus strategy in order to get anything done. Plus, NATO and the US are not going to agree on AI. NATO disagrees with the demonization of China on AI that the U.S. has created. So one of the reasons why NATO doesn't want to work with the U.S. on AI is because the U.S. has framed things, like the affirmative does, that China is sort of the master of AI technology. China is going to lead the world on AI technology. China is going to use AI technology in an authoritarian manner, and we can't trust China. But NATO wants to work with China on things like the Belt and Road Initiative, where China is investing in the infrastructure of a lot of nations around the world. And so NATO doesn't necessarily agree with this technology arms race that the affirmative is talking about. And as a result of that, they're not going to want to cooperate with the U.S. on AI in order to box China into a corner. Plus, the notion that just getting NATO on board is going to be enough to control AI technology in an ethical manner around the world is probably false. You have to get Russia and China to the table. Now, the affirmative is going to have evidence that says if you get the West all on board together, that will put pressure on Russia and China, but I don't necessarily think that's enough to get them to the table. They're already facing pressure from those things. Russia's already involved in Ukraine. China is already building up in the South and East China Seas. I'm not sure why getting NATO on board is going to be enough to establish international norms on artificial intelligence technology. So my conclusion is the AI Operability Act has good generic answers to some of the disads and some of the counterplans. But the specifics of the app aren't as strong. If you actually go and research whether or not AI is good for nuclear stability, whether or not AI is going to lead to nuclear arms control, whether or not China is actually going to win the AI race, I think you can begin to find a lot of flaws in the affirmative. The case turns are actually quite good. I'm especially thinking of the debate about whether or not the integration of AI into nuclear technology is good or bad. There's a huge debate on this question. The Johnson evidence in the file is very good that says that historically we've had good norms on the question of nuclear technology because we've had human involvement and human intervention, and that the presumption should be against changing that, and the presumption should be against allowing artificial intelligence more control over those systems. So I think you can do a good job on that. I also think the solvency attacks are strong. The notion that NATO is actually going to successfully cooperate on these things when you have 30 different nations at different stages of development. I think there's going to be some questions as to what the affirmative is allowed to fiat. I'm going to leave those questions to your lab leaders, like what does it mean to have a plan that cooperates? Usually we don't have cooperation as an active verb in the resolution. So is the plan an offer to cooperate and then NATO responds? Does the affirmative get to fiat NATO in any capacity? If the affirmative is limited to an offer to NATO, then I think it would be difficult to get NATO to agree to the same kind of standard on artificial intelligence because they're all in different places in the technology. They all have different ethical stances toward the technology, and it's difficult to get them to agree on one universal standard for how we ought to use AI. And that's how I think I would attack this affirmative.